On what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, Richard Coleman, a millionaire known for his polished demeanor and impeccable Italian suits, pulled up in front of a run-down apartment building. His purpose was simple: collect overdue rent. To him, this was just another line item in a spreadsheet full of faceless properties. But what awaited him behind that door would completely redefine his understanding of investment. A young black girl, no older than 10, sat hunched over an old sewing machine, her small frame, makeshift bandages on her hands, and eyes heavy with fatigue, yet full of resilience, painted a haunting picture. In the dim, musty room, brightly colored fabric scraps folded neatly beside her were the only glimmer of light in a somber canvas of life. "My mom's asleep. What do you need, sir?" she asked, softly but firmly, catching Richard off guard. He was used to obedience and fear, not this quiet strength. He muttered, "I'm here to collect rent. It's 2 weeks overdue." The girl didn't panic. She gently set her needle down, opened a worn wooden box, and handed him a crumpled envelope. "This is only half. I'll pay the rest when I finish these clothes." Richard counted the old, worn bills, money he'd usually never touch. A flood of questions raced through his mind. Why is a child handling this? Why isn't she in school? Where are her parents? A violent cough from the next room interrupted his thoughts. "My mom's sick," the girl said, as if it were too familiar to worry about. "I'm working on an order for Miss Patterson. She pays well and sends more clients." He looked at her again, hands calloused, eyes tired but unwavering, and garments stitched with the care and precision of an artist. In that moment, for the first time in his life, Richard didn't feel like an owner. He felt like an intruder in a world too real, too beautiful, and too heartbreaking. He, a man raised in luxury, educated at elite international schools, heir to a vast real estate empire, felt like he had wandered into a parallel universe, one not measured in square footage or market value, but in grit and quiet love. This little girl, with just a glance and a single sentence, shrunk his entire proud past down to nothing. "What's your name?" he asked softly, afraid to break the moment. "Zoe." "Zoe Williams," she replied, turning back to the steady hum of the sewing machine. A quiet, sad song of strength in the shadows of life. As he walked away, Richard's steps were slower than usual. A swirl of emotions rose inside. Some shame, some remorse, but also something unfamiliar. For the first time, he didn't see that apartment as a stream of passive income, but as a fragile home fighting to survive. Back in his Tesla, he looked out at the struggling neighborhood through the window. Muddy alleys, peeling walls, dim yellow lights at dusk. No longer just areas in need of redevelopment, as his reports labeled them, but places where real people lived, loved, and endured. The phrase up-and-coming neighborhood his partners often used now rang hollow, even cruel. Behind those words were hundreds of families being slowly pushed out, swept aside by a heartless wave of so-called progress. Have you ever wondered, can a seemingly random encounter, a child's steady gaze, shift the mindset of someone atop a tower of power? Can one cramped room, one girl with rough hands and a fierce heart, awaken a cold investor? The answer doesn't lie in spreadsheets. It lies in this. Who has the courage to stop and truly see? "They won't let me see my mom," Zoe said when she saw Richard arrive at the hospital, skipping pleasantries. "They say I'm too young to be in the room alone. An adult has to be with me. I gave them your number because you're the landlord." Those words might have seemed simple, but to Richard they felt like a silent blade piercing his pride. A child, in a moment of panic and helplessness, had turned to him. A stranger, a symbol of power and the system, as her only source of support. A painful question echoed in his mind. What could have made a little girl grow up so fast that she knew exactly who to call the authority in a crisis like this? As they sat outside the ICU, Richard began to piece together the fragments he knew about Zoe and her mother. Elaine, Zoe's mother, had once been a skilled seamstress, but after falling ill, she had been working quietly from home. And Zoe, though only 11 years old, had stepped into her mother's shoes, managing orders, negotiating deadlines, and handling all the household expenses on her own. No one taught her, no one backed her up. She relied only on herself and the love she had for her mother lying in that hospital bed. Richard realized this was no longer a visit out of obligation. This was a turning point. What had started as a random encounter was now shaking the foundation of his worldview and lifestyle. A man who had believed that kindness could be measured in charitable donations, and that justice was something to be discussed in luxury boardrooms. Do you believe that a single look, a simple act, can shake an ivory tower built on profit and privilege? If you think these things only happen in movies, keep reading, because the truth is waiting to be revealed, and it's deeper than any script ever written. Inside the recovery wing of Mercy Hospital, Richard walked alongside Zoe. His polished leather shoes echoed awkwardly against the sterile white hallway. A stern nurse raised her hand to stop them. "Only immediate family is allowed inside," she said, her eyes glancing suspiciously at his expensive suit. "He's my uncle," Zoe answered without hesitation, as if it were a truth she had always believed. The nurse looked at Richard, a white man standing next to a small black girl, with clear skepticism, but then, perhaps sensing something in Zoe's eyes, she reluctantly nodded. And so, two people who seemed to have nothing in common, divided by race, class, and a stratified society, stepped into the hospital room where the past and present were about to collide, to confront a much larger question: what does family really mean? Elaine Williams lay motionless among the cold beats of medical machines. Her frail body seemed to disappear beneath the white sheets and the tangled IV lines. "Severe pneumonia, complicated by tuberculosis," Dr. Carson reported in a low, cautious tone. "She'll need to stay at least 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by continued care at home." Richard nodded slightly, but Zoe looked like the life had been drained from her. 3 days, she whispered to herself. "If she stays longer than 3 days, they'll know I'm alone." Her voice began to tremble. "They almost took me before. This time, they'll really do it." Before she could finish, a middle-aged black woman appeared, hair in a high bun, a name badge around her neck. Diana Morris, Child Protective Services, CPS. She walked straight over. "Zoe Williams?" she asked. "I'm Diana from CPS. We need to talk about your temporary living arrangements." Zoe's face went pale. Her eyes darted around the hallway, searching for an escape. Richard didn't need another second to understand. She was about to run. "He's under my care," he said, the words flying out before he could think. "I'm Richard Coleman, the landlord where they live. Her mother has entrusted me with temporary care." Deanna raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Do you have any documentation to prove that?" "I'll have it today," Richard replied firmly. "My attorney will take care of it." And just like that, in a matter of minutes, Rishad, who had once known only lease agreements and financial reports, stepped into an entirely different world, one filled with paperwork, skepticism, and strict human responsibility standards. The following days were a whirlwind of phone calls, documents, and legal debates. Martin Goldstein, his trusted attorney, nearly shouted through the phone, "Are you out of your mind, Richard? You've never changed a diaper, never cooked a single meal for a child. They're never going to hand that girl over to you." But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't need legal advice to decide. He wasn't acting for his reputation, his portfolio, or even out of guilt, but for the eyes of a little girl who had carried the weight of the world just to protect her sick mother. Have you ever found yourself in a situation you weren't prepared for but knew you couldn't walk away from? And is there anything more powerful than an awakening of the heart? Sometimes it's the people we least expect who teach us the greatest lessons in love and responsibility. Then make them agree, Richard replied firmly, his eyes unwavering. This girl is not going to a foster home. While the legal process was underway, Richard brought Zoe to his luxurious penthouse. She stepped into the apartment like she was entering a foreign world, her eyes scanning every object cautiously, as if the slightest touch might shatter it all. You can choose any room you like, Richard said gently. I want to be closer to my mom, Zoe answered immediately without hesitation. I can sleep at the hospital. You can't, Zoe. Hospital policy doesn't allow it, and you need to rest. I still have work to do. Miss Patterson already paid in advance. Richard looked at her small hands, calloused from labor. We don't need that money right now. I do, Zoe said firmly. It's my responsibility. The next day they met again with Diana, the CPS caseworker, at attorney Martin Goldstein's office. Mr. Coleman, a single man with no blood relation requesting guardianship of a young girl is highly unusual, Diana said bluntly. I'm simply helping a tenant. The alternative is putting her into the system, which could separate her from her mother permanently. Diana turned to Zoe, who remained silent but watchful. Zoe, do you want to stay with Mr. Coleman or go to a foster home? Hell lets me work, Zoe answered honestly. They won't at the foster home, and if I don't work, we'll lose our place. As they were leaving, Diana pulled Richard aside. I'm watching you, Mr. Coleman. If I see anything suspicious, I'll act immediately. But what no one noticed was a black car parked just a few yards away. Inside sat Victoria Reynolds, chairwoman of the Coleman Estates Board, quietly taking pictures, a woman known for her cold demeanor and limitless ambition. When Richard joined the board a few years ago, she had seen him as a potential threat to her power, and now she may have found her opportunity. In the days that followed, Richard made an interesting discovery while reviewing the lease agreement. Your rent hasn't gone up in 5 years, he said. All the other properties have had price adjustments. My mom had an arrangement with the previous landlord, Zoe explained. She used to fix his clothes for free. And now you're doing it in her place, Richard murmured, beginning to see the thread that had quietly tied everything together over the years. Meanwhile, at the Coleman Estates headquarters, Victoria presented her discovery to the board. Richard is harboring a black child with no confirmed guardianship. The press will eat this up. What exactly are you suggesting? Another board member asked, clearly uncomfortable. I'm saying Richard is acting recklessly and damaging the company's reputation, Victoria replied coldly. I propose we take action to protect our collective interests. But what Victoria didn't realize was this. While she schemed to use Zoe as a political pawn, the girl had quietly been building a network of protection for herself. Amid the needles, spools of thread, and hospital visits, Zoe watched and remembered. Every phone call Richard made, every document he left lying on the table, she missed nothing. In an old math notebook, she recorded everything, meticulously, systematically. Have you ever imagined an 11-year-old girl, instead of playing with dolls or taking dance classes, silently leading the moves in a game played by the powerful? That little girl, a seemingly minor character in life's flow, was now shifting the entire trajectory of those perched atop their towers. Somewhere in the maze of invisible strings lay a hidden truth. The reason why, out of hundreds of apartments in the city, Zoe's mother had insisted on staying in a building owned by the Coleman family. A truth powerful enough to permanently shift the balance of power within the elite household. 1 week later, Richard received an unexpected call. Victoria Reynolds, CEO of Coleman Estates, demanded his immediate presence at an emergency board meeting. The icy tone in her assistant's voice made it clear this was no friendly invitation. "They're planning to remove you from the board," warned Martin, his personal lawyer. "Victoria's dug up your connection to the girl. She'll use it to question your leadership." At the same time, over at the hospital, Elaine Williams' condition had stabilized, but she had yet to fully regain consciousness. Pressing questions piled up without answers. In the penthouse apartment, Zoe sat focused at the sewing machine. But this time, she wasn't crafting dresses, she was stitching together pieces of a far greater secret. "Are you really going to face them?" Zoe asked, eyes fixed on the seam as Richard adjusted his tie before heading out. "My house too, it's my company too." "Then take this." Zoe handed him her school notebook, page 27. Richard opened it and went still. The page was filled with clippings of old newspaper articles, photocopied documents, and neatly organized notes, complete with dates, locations, and names. In the center, a yellowed article, a photo of his father, William Coleman, standing with a group of workers. Among them, a young woman, Elaine Williams. "Why did you get this?" "My mom kept it in a box," Zoe replied. "She used to work in the first Coleman building, sewing uniforms for the staff. Your dad promised to share the profits with everyone." Zoe didn't have to finish. The sharpness in her eyes said the rest. Richard faintly recalled an old scandal. Something his father had buried under layers of confidentiality agreements. Dozens of workers, most of them people of color, had been dismissed without compensation, just as the company began turning a major profit. "And there's more," Zoe said, flipping to the next page. "Victoria used to be the head of legal back then. She was the one who drafted the fake contracts to silence the workers." When Richard stepped into the glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of the Coleman building, 9 board members were already seated. Victoria, dressed in a flawless gray suit, wore a smug smile, the kind of person who always believed she held all the cards. "Gentlemen," she began in a calm but icy tone, "I've called this meeting to address a serious issue affecting the image of Coleman Estates." On the projector screen appeared a photo of Richard and Zoe leaving a Child Protective Services office. "Richard Coleman has secretly brought a minor, a black child with no legal familial connection, into his home. This has the potential to become a major media scandal." Whispers rippled through the room. Victoria continued, her voice full of calculated concern. "I propose, Mr. Coleman, step down temporarily so the board can review his leadership capabilities." But in a room where every eye was laced with suspicion and prejudice, could a school notebook truly flip the entire boardroom dynamic? Dear readers, if you were Richard, would you open to page 27 right there, in front of the board? Would you stay silent to protect your reputation, or step into the light and let the truth speak? The boardroom fell silent. Richard said nothing. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. When Victoria finished her veiled indictment, he simply opened his laptop, connected it to the projector, and spoke in a calm voice. "Before we vote, I'd like to share a few documents recently uncovered." The screen displayed an original contract bearing the signature of his father, William Coleman, promising company shares to the first 50 employees. Among those signatures, Eileen Williams. Next came the altered contract, signed by Victoria herself, permitting changes to the terms. These documents show that Miss Victoria Reynolds directly orchestrated the fraud that stole rightful benefits from dozens of black families. Richard turned to Victoria. Her face had gone pale. With compound interest, those shares would be worth approximately $25 million today. Victoria shot up. Ridiculous. This is just fake evidence made up by a child. This is the original from my father's personal archive, Richard interrupted. And I found it thanks to Zoe Williams, the daughter of one of the victims you deceived. The room erupted. One senior advisor removed his glasses and, Mr. Peterson, Richard addressed him, do you remember this? You worked with my father back then? The man nodded slowly. I remember there were rumors, but Williams said everyone had been fairly compensated. A lie Victoria helped spread, Richard replied, then projected archived emails between William Coleman and Victoria discussing how to cover up the deception, targeting black workers. Victoria pulled out her phone, attempting to call someone, but Martin, the lawyer, had already stepped into the room unnoticed. No need to rush, Ms. Reynolds, he said. We've already sent full copies of these documents to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and all major media outlets. He gave a cold smile. Might be wise to make that call to your criminal attorney instead. For the first time in her career, built on secrecy and manipulation, Victoria Reynolds, the once untouchable queen of Coleman Estates, looked small and shaken. Her closest advisors began calling for her immediate resignation. The next day, headlines across major newspapers blared on the front pages. Shock at Coleman Estates, nearly half a century of racial discrimination exposed. The company's stock plummeted 30% within the first few hours of trading. Victoria was summoned for a federal investigation. As for Richard, he returned to the hospital, where Elaine Williams had finally woken up. At her bedside, Zoe smiled, the first real smile since the day Richard met her. My mom always said, the truth finds its way, the girl whispered, holding her mother's frail hand, even if it takes a whole generation. But no one could have guessed. This was only the beginning. At that bedside, as Elaine looked at Richard and Zoe, two pieces that now seemed inseparable, a deeper secret still lingered in the air between them. A truth with the power to not only transform Coleman Estates but also redefine identity, legacy, and the future of everyone involved in this story. 3 months after the scandal that rocked the city, the name Coleman in Boston had taken on a whole new meaning. Outside the company's headquarters now hung a gleaming new sign, Coleman and Williams Holdings. But this wasn't just a change in name, it was a bold declaration of a radically new future. Richard Coleman had done what no one ever thought he would dare to do. After DNA test results confirmed what his heart had long suspected, he made it public. Zoe Williams was his biological daughter. My family was built on systemic exploitation, robbing the labor and dignity of countless black workers, Richard said at a press conference, with Zoe and Elaine still weak but standing by his side. I can't change the past, but I can rewrite the future. Shortly after, the Coleman Reparations Fund was established, with 40% of the company's shares transferred to the trust. Its mission: to compensate the employees and families who had been deceived. For the 23 workers who had passed away with no surviving heirs, their portion was redirected to fund scholarships for young black students from underprivileged communities. And inside the new boardroom, once filled exclusively with white men making decisions over black neighborhoods, now sat genuine representatives from those very communities. They had voices, votes, and real influence over investment decisions that directly affected their people. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds, once the reigning queen of Coleman Estates, was now facing multiple criminal charges. The empire of deceit she had built over decades crumbled in a matter of weeks. The documents, the witnesses, and the truth were undeniable. In conversations with her attorneys, Victoria repeated bitterly, "It was that girl. How could a child expose what a team of lawyers kept hidden for decades?" The answer was surprisingly simple. Elaine Williams wasn't just a seamstress. In the early days of the company, she had been an assistant secretary, with access to documents no one paid attention to. The moment she sensed something was wrong, she quietly backed up every piece of evidence. For years, she kept everything, waiting for the right moment. "I knew one day Richard would come back," Elaine whispered to Zoe once they were home. "Not for me, but for you. That's why I kept it all, from the good to the ugly, to prove who he really was." In the room that once served as her sewing studio, now Zoe's study, father and daughter often spent hours talking, sometimes with ease, sometimes with difficulty. They spoke about privilege, about race, about a system that once forced a black girl to work like an adult, while a white child never would have had to. "I wasn't embarrassed because you came to collect rent that day," Zoe said one afternoon as she showed Richard her new school project. "It was because you'd never really seen before." The Points That Connect project, named by Zoe, transformed the once dilapidated building into a school for crafts, design, and entrepreneurship, aimed at youth from marginalized communities. And in every stitch, every notebook page, every determined look from the students learning there, came a quiet reminder. Real change doesn't begin with power. It begins with listening. The first class welcomed 30 girls, young students from low-income neighborhoods across Boston. Their lead instructor, none other than Zoe. At just 12 years old, she taught sewing techniques that many professional tailors had never mastered. With a needle in hand, Zoe wasn't just teaching craft, she was teaching confidence, perseverance, and hope. 6 months after the fall of the old Coleman Estates, Victoria Reynolds was sentenced to 9 years in prison on charges of fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of justice. That same day, a new chapter began. The City Council officially approved a new urban redevelopment plan by Coleman and Williams. This project didn't aim to erase or displace local communities. Instead, the contracts were rewritten to ensure housing access for low-income families. In an interview, Richard shared, "Some people spend their whole lives learning what I learned in 6 months, that wealth without purpose is just hollow accumulation, that privilege without responsibility is its own form of violence, silent but real." Back in their new home, Elaine continued to recover. Her hands, once worn from years of work, were now steadier than ever. But this time she wasn't alone. She led a team of seamstresses, creating school uniforms to donate to public schools in the area. One crisp fall afternoon, as Zoe adjusted her mother's dress, Richard walked in holding an old wooden box. "I found this in my father's files," he said, setting the box on the table and carefully opening it. Inside were dozens of uniform and workwear design sketches, all bearing Elaine Williams' signature from more than 20 years ago. Designs the company had used but never acknowledged or compensated her for. Anton always knew that she was the real designer, Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion. But he still let Victoria run the show. Elaine picked up one of the drawings, her hand gliding gently over the yellowed paper. I never drew for money or recognition. I drew because I loved it. And that's why your designs were so beautiful, Zoe said, eyes lighting up. And that's why mine are too. That night, as the city fell asleep, 3 generations, one man once blinded by privilege, one woman stripped of her credit, but never her dignity, and one young girl bridging 2 worlds, sat together, sketching out a future. A future where a person's worth isn't dictated by the color of their skin, or the zip code they were born into. A man discovered that his true inheritance wasn't luxury real estate, but a daughter he almost never knew was his. A woman, her talent stolen, but her integrity intact. A young girl with a needle and thread, stitching not just fabric, but a bridge between seemingly irreconcilable worlds. Thousands of kids like Zoe are still out there fighting invisible battles every day. But stories like this remind us real change begins when those with power dare to look past the reflection of their own privilege. If this story touched your heart, stay with us to discover more stories where small, courageous acts can shake entire systems of injustice, because true legacy isn't measured by bank accounts, but by the lives we've touched and changed. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like so we can keep bringing more meaningful, inspiring stories your way. Let's spread the message together. Change begins with the smallest things.